I stared at the water below as our float plane descended, my stomach dropping faster than the aircraft. The pristine lake stretched out beneath us, surrounded by dense forest that looked like it could swallow us whole. This wasn't where I wanted to spend the next 3 days of my life. "Isn't this amazing?" Dad shouted over the engine noise. His face lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "Look at that water clarity. You can see straight to the bottom." I gave him a half-hearted nod, not wanting to encourage him. This whole family bonding trip was his idea, not mine. I'd made that abundantly clear for weeks, but here we were anyway, about to be dumped in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but our camping gear and each other. Hannah sat across from me, headphones firmly in place, gaze fixed on her phone as she frantically typed what I assumed were goodbye messages to her friends. In about 20 minutes, she'd lose signal completely. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. At least I'd been camping before. Hannah had managed to avoid Dad's outdoor adventures until now. The float plane hit the water with a series of bumps that sent spray across the windows. Dad whooped with delight while Hannah finally looked up, her expression a mix of alarm and annoyance. "Perfect landing, Levi," Dad called to the pilot. Levi Marquez nodded, his weathered face showing just a hint of a smile as he guided the plane toward a natural dock formation, a flat stretch of rock that extended into the water. "Water's calm today. Makes it easy." As the engine cut, the sudden silence felt heavy. I could hear water lapping against the pontoons and birds calling in the distance. Hannah pulled off her headphones with obvious reluctance. "No signal," she muttered, holding her phone up in different directions as if that might help. "That's the point," Dad said, clapping his hands together. 3 days, just the three of us. No distractions, no work calls, no social media. Just nature and family. Hannah and I exchanged a look that said everything words couldn't. Levi opened the door, letting in the smell of pine and lake water. "Let's get your gear unloaded. I need to head back before the weather changes." We climbed out onto the pontoon and then jumped one by one onto the rocky shore. I helped Levi and Dad unload our supplies, 3 backpacks, a small cooler, Dad's fishing gear, and a bag of additional camping equipment. The whole time, Hannah stood off to the side, still holding her phone up like some kind of talisman. "Remember, no pickup until Friday at 4, Levi said as he handed Dad the last bag. "Radio if there's an emergency, but reception can be spotty. I'll do my best to check in daily." Dad shook his hand firmly. "We'll be fine. I've been planning this trip for months." I watched Levi's face for any sign that he thought leaving us here was a bad idea, but he just nodded professionally. "The weather report looks good, but keep an eye on the clouds coming from the north. If it turns, use the emergency shelter coordinates I gave you." "Got it," Dad said, patting the waterproof map case in his pocket. Levi climbed back into the plane, and within minutes, the engine roared to life. We stood on the shore watching as he taxied away, turned into the wind, and took off. The plane grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely, and just like that, we were alone. "Well," Dad turned to us with forced cheer. "Let's get moving. Camp's about a mile inland. Perfect spot with a clearing for our tents and access to fresh water." Hannah finally pocketed her phone. "A mile? In this heat?" "It's barely 75 degrees, I said, hoisting my backpack. "Could be worse." "Thanks for the support, Paul," Dad said, clearly misinterpreting my comment as enthusiasm rather than the bare minimum of cooperation. We started walking, Dad in front, me in the middle, and Hannah trailing behind. The path, if you could call it that, was barely visible, just a slight depression in the undergrowth that Dad seemed to be following based on some sixth sense. Or maybe the GPS unit he kept checking. "This island has some fascinating history," Dad began, launching into tour guide mode. "The indigenous people of this region used it for special ceremonies. There are even rumors of old stone structures deeper in the forest." "Fascinating," Hannah muttered behind me. I adjusted my pack straps, already feeling sweat gathering on my back. The forest around us was beautiful in an oppressive way. Tall pines and thick undergrowth that seemed to close in behind us as we walked. Everything was so green it almost hurt my eyes, and the air smelled rich with decomposing leaves and pine resin. Did you know this region has some of the oldest growth forest in the province? Dad continued, undeterred by our lack of enthusiasm. Some of these trees could be 200 years old. Wow, I said flatly. Dad stopped suddenly, turning to face us. Look, I know neither of you wanted to come, but we're here now, and we might as well make the best of it. This is important to me. His face had that earnest, slightly desperate look that always made me feel guilty. I knew this trip mattered to him. He'd been talking about it for months, ever since the divorce was finalized. Quality time, he'd called it, a chance to reconnect as a family. It's fine, Dad, I said, not meeting his eyes. Let's just get to camp. Hannah said nothing, just stared at her hiking boots. We continued walking, the silence broken only by the crunch of leaves under our feet, and Dad's occasional comment about local wildlife or plant species. After about 40 minutes, the trees thinned slightly, and we emerged into a small clearing. Here we are, Dad announced, dropping his pack with a heavy thud. Home for the next 3 days. The clearing was about 30 feet across, ringed by tall pines and a few birch trees. A small stream trickled along one edge, and the ground was relatively flat, good for pitching tents. In another context, I might have appreciated how perfect it was for camping. Instead, I just felt trapped. Let's set up before it gets much later, Dad said, already unpacking the tent poles. Paul, you want to find some rocks for a fire pit? Hannah, could you filter some water? Hannah looked like she might protest, but instead grabbed the water filter and bottles from Dad's outstretched hand and trudged toward the stream. I wandered the clearing's edge, collecting suitable rocks for a fire ring. As I worked, I kept glancing at the dense forest surrounding us. From inside the trees, the light seemed different, darker, greener, with shadows that moved even when there wasn't any wind. I shook the thought away. It was just a forest. I'd been camping plenty of times before. By the time the sun began to lower, we had 3 small tents set up in a triangle around a proper fire pit. Dad had insisted we each have our own tent. Privacy is important at your ages. Though I suspected it was also because neither Hannah nor I had been willing to bunk with him. Our tents formed points of a triangle, with the fire pit in the center. Dad got a small fire going and heated water for our freeze-dried dinners. We sat on logs he'd dragged over, eating in silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't openly hostile either. So, Dad said finally, school starts in a few weeks. Senior year for you, Paul. Any thoughts about colleges yet? I poked at my reconstituted pasta. Not really. You should start thinking about it. Applications will be due before you know it. I know. And Hannah, sophomore year. Any clubs you're thinking of joining? Hannah shrugged. Maybe photography. That's great. I could get you a proper camera if you're interested. Not just phone photography, but real. My phone camera is fine, Hannah cut in. It's just for the easy credits anyway. Dad's face fell slightly, but he rallied. Well, it's still a good skill to develop. Maybe you could take some nature shots while we're here. Hannah didn't respond, just scraped the last of her dinner from the pouch. As darkness settled around us, the forest came alive with sounds. The hoot of an owl, rustling in the underbrush, the constant chorus of insects. Dad tried a few more conversation starters, but eventually gave up when our responses remained minimal. Well, he said finally, standing up and stretching, I think I'll turn in. Big day tomorrow. Fishing in the morning, then maybe a hike to the North Shore. The guidebook mentioned some interesting rock formations. Sounds great, I said, not bothering to hide my lack of enthusiasm. Dad hesitated, looking from me to Hannah and back again. For a moment, I thought he might say something real. Something about Mom or the divorce or why he really brought us out here. Instead, he just sighed. Good night, then. Don't stay up too late, and make sure the fire's completely out before you go to sleep. After he zipped himself into his tent, Hannah and I sat in silence for a few minutes. This sucks, she finally said, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Yeah, 3 days. How are we going to survive 3 days? I shrugged. 1 day at a time, I guess. Very philosophical. She stood up, brushing off her pants. I'm going to bed. At least I downloaded some books before we lost signal. After she disappeared into her tent, I sat alone by the dying fire. The flames had dwindled to glowing embers that cast just enough light to make the surrounding darkness seem even deeper. I poured water over them, watching the steam rise and listening to the hiss as the last of the fire died. With the fire out, the darkness pressed in from all sides. I used my flashlight to find my way to my tent, zipped myself in, and laid back on my sleeping bag. Outside, the forest noises continued, a symphony of unfamiliar sounds that should have been soothing, but instead left me on edge. I stared up at the tent ceiling, listening to a branch scrape against something in the wind. Dad's snoring started up from his tent, a familiar sound that should have been comforting but just reminded me of all the nights after Mom left, when it was just the two of us in that too empty house. The complete isolation of our situation suddenly hit me full force. We were miles from the nearest person, on an island accessible only by plane or boat, with limited communication to the outside world. If anything happened, if someone got hurt or sick, or if the weather turned, we were on our own. I rolled onto my side, trying to get comfortable on the thin sleeping pad. Tomorrow would be fishing and hiking and more of Dad's forced enthusiasm, more of Hannah's sullen silence, more of my own uncomfortable position in the middle. Sleep felt impossibly far away as I lay there, listening to the unfamiliar night sounds and feeling a growing sense of unease that I couldn't quite name. Something beyond normal teenage resentment or discomfort with the wilderness. Something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, we weren't as alone on this island as we thought. I woke to the sound of something scratching against my tent. Probably just a branch, but after the restless night I'd had, every noise felt like a threat. The morning light filtered through the orange fabric, making the tent glow like a jack-o'-lantern. I hadn't slept much. Between Dad's snoring from the next tent over and the unfamiliar forest sounds, my mind kept racing with worst-case scenarios about being stranded out here. Rise and shine, campers, Dad's voice boomed from outside, way too cheerful for how early it felt. I groaned and rolled over, checking my watch, 6:30, on summer break. This was exactly why I didn't want to come on this trip. The zipper on my tent rattled as I pulled it down, letting in a rush of cool morning air. Dad was already fully dressed, crouched by a small fire, poking at something in a metal pot. "Morning, buddy. Sleep well?" he asked, not looking up from whatever he was cooking. "Not really," I mumbled, crawling out and stretching my stiff back. Sleeping on the ground was as uncomfortable as I'd expected. Hannah's tent remained zipped tight. Smart move on her part. "I made oatmeal," Dad announced, holding up a spoonful of gray mush like it was some gourmet meal. "We've got a big day ahead. Thought we'd explore the northern part of the island after breakfast." I nodded, not bothering to fake enthusiasm. What was the point? We were stuck here until Levi returned with the plane on Friday. 3 full days of reconnecting with nature, as Dad kept calling it. 20 minutes later, Hannah finally emerged from her tent, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, looking about as thrilled as I felt. She took the bowl Dad offered without a word and sat on a fallen log across from me. "So," Dad said, clearly trying to generate some excitement, "I've been studying the map Levi gave us. There's supposed to be some interesting terrain on the north side of the island. Old-growth forest, rock formations, maybe even some wildlife if we're quiet. Great, Hannah muttered, not looking up from her oatmeal. Come on, guys. This is supposed to be fun, Dad said, his perpetual optimism starting to crack a little. A little family adventure. I felt a twinge of guilt. He'd planned this whole thing, probably spent a bunch of money on it too. The least I could do was try not to be completely miserable. Yeah, sounds cool, I offered, though my heart wasn't in it. When do we leave? Dad's face brightened. As soon as we clean up breakfast. Just bring water and a light pack. We'll be back by afternoon. An hour later, we were hiking single file along what could barely be called a trail. Dad led the way, using his GPS unit occasionally to check our direction. I followed behind him with Hannah bringing up the rear, her attention split between watching her footing and glancing longingly at her useless phone. The forest was thicker than it had seemed from the air. Massive trees towered overhead, their branches creating a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. Underbrush grew in tangled clumps, sometimes forcing us to push through or find a way around. Look at these trees, Dad said, stopping to place his hand on the trunk of a particularly massive specimen. Some of these are probably 200 or 300 years old. I had to admit they were impressive. The trunk was wider than Dad could reach around, with bark that looked like armor plating. As we continued walking, I noticed something odd. The forest was getting quieter. When we'd first set out, there had been bird calls, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the background hum of insects. But the deeper we went, the more those sounds faded. Is it just me? Or is it really quiet? I asked, stopping to listen. Dad paused, tilting his head. I guess it is pretty peaceful out here. That wasn't what I meant. It wasn't peaceful. It was empty, like the wildlife knew something we didn't. Can we take a break? Hannah called from behind me. My feet hurt. We've only been walking for like 45 minutes, I pointed out. She glared at me. So, these aren't exactly hiking boots. She gestured to her sneakers, which, to be fair, weren't meant for this kind of terrain. There's a clearing up ahead, Dad said, checking his GPS. We can stop there for a few minutes. We pushed through a particularly dense patch of underbrush, and suddenly the forest opened up. But it wasn't just any clearing. 7 massive stones stood in a perfect circle, each about 8 feet tall and covered in weathered markings. They reminded me of pictures I'd seen of Stonehenge, only smaller and more complete. The grass inside the circle was shorter than the surrounding area, as if it grew differently there. The moment I saw it, something cold slithered down my spine. There was something wrong about this place. Not just unusual or unexpected, but wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Whoa, Dad said, walking toward the nearest stone. This is incredible. This has to be some kind of indigenous ceremonial site. Hannah finally looked up from her phone. Weird, she said, which from her was practically enthusiasm. I hung back at the edge of the clearing. Should we really be disturbing this place? I asked. It looks important. Dad was already examining one of the stones, running his hands over the surface. We're not disturbing anything. We're just looking. This is exactly the kind of thing I hoped we'd find out here. Reluctantly, I stepped into the clearing. The air felt different somehow, heavier. The silence that had been growing as we hiked was complete here. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of our own breathing and footsteps. Look at these carvings, Dad called, waving me over. They must be ancient. I approached one of the stones opposite from where Dad was standing. The surface was covered in strange symbols, spirals, lines, and shapes that might have been animals or people, all weathered by time and the elements. Something compelled me to touch them. I reached out slowly, my fingers tracing the outline of what looked like a spiral. The stone felt cold, much colder than it should have been on a summer day. The moment my skin made contact, something happened. It wasn't dramatic, no flash of light or sudden noise, but for a split second I thought I heard voices, Not clear words, but whispers, just at the edge of hearing, like a radio tuned between stations. I yanked my hand back, heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking around wildly. Dad glanced up from the stone he was examining. "Hear what?" "Voices," I said, then immediately regretted it when I saw the look on his face. "It's just the wind in the trees," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Or maybe your imagination. These places can have that effect on people." But there was no wind. The air was completely still. Hannah had wandered to the center of the circle and was taking pictures with her phone. "This'll look cool on Instagram when we get back to civilization," she said, seemingly unaffected by the eerie atmosphere that was making my skin crawl. I forced myself to touch the stone again, pressing my palm flat against the cold surface. Nothing happened this time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the trees. "How old do you think these are?" I asked, trying to sound normal. Dad shrugged. "Hard to say without an expert. Hundreds of years at least, maybe older." "And no one studied them before, or put up signs or anything?" "This island is pretty remote," Dad replied. "Levi mentioned that not many people come out here, and these forests are dense. Easy to miss something like this if you don't know it's here." We spent about 20 minutes exploring the circle. Dad took photos and notes, completely absorbed. Hannah lost interest after taking her pictures and sat on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, back to staring at her phone despite the lack of signal. I tried to act normal, examining the stones and the surrounding area, but the whole time, that sense of wrongness grew stronger. There was something about this place that didn't want us here. "I think we should go," I said finally. "We still have a lot of island to explore, right?" Dad looked up, surprised. "We just got here. Don't you want to look around more?" "I've seen enough," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And Hannah's bored." Hannah perked up at the mention of her name. "Yeah, can we go? There's nothing to do here." Dad sighed, clearly disappointed. "All right, I guess we can continue our hike. But I want to come back here tomorrow with better equipment. I'd like to make some rubbings of these carvings." The idea of returning made my stomach clench, but I nodded, just wanting to get away from the stones. As we left the clearing, I looked back one last time. In the shadows between two of the standing stones, I thought I saw something move. Just a flicker of pale color that vanished when I blinked. Probably just my imagination working overtime. But it didn't help the growing knot of dread in my chest. The hike back to camp felt longer than the journey out. Dad kept stopping to point out interesting plants or signs of wildlife, but I couldn't focus on what he was saying. My mind kept returning to the stone circle and those almost heard whispers. By the time we reached camp, the sun was starting to lower in the sky. Dad suggested fishing in the lake before dinner, but I begged off, claiming I was tired from the hike. Hannah, predictably, also declined, retreating to her tent with her e-reader. I sat by the water's edge, skipping stones across the glassy surface and trying to convince myself I was overreacting. It was just an old ceremonial site, like Dad said. Indigenous people had lived on these islands for thousands of years. Of course, they left things behind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to find. That night, after a dinner of freeze-dried stroganoff that tasted like salty cardboard, we sat around the campfire. Dad tried again to engage us in conversation, asking about our plans for the school year. I made an effort to respond, feeling bad about how the day had gone, but my heart wasn't in it. Hannah barely spoke at all. When the fire burned down to embers, we each retreated to our tents. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the orange fabric, listening to the night sounds of the forest. Despite my exhaustion, sleep felt far away. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the stone circle. In the dream, I stood at the edge of the clearing, but something was different. The stones seemed taller, more imposing. The markings glowed with a faint blue light, pulsing like a heartbeat. Between the stones, a figure moved. Pale and slender, it drifted from one monolith to another, never quite visible enough to make out details. Just a suggestion of white against the darkness. Then it stopped and seemed to look directly at me. I couldn't see a face, but I knew it was watching me. And then, carried on air that didn't move, I heard my name. Paul. The voice was neither male nor female, young nor old, just my name, spoken as if from a great distance. Paul. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. The figure began to approach, gliding across the grass without seeming to take steps. Paul. I jolted awake, heart hammering in my chest. The inside of my tent was dark, no moonlight filtered through the fabric. I must have been asleep for hours. Something felt wrong. The air was colder than it should have been, and I had a strange sensation in my legs, like pins and needles. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling in the darkness. When I finally clicked it on, the beam revealed the inside of my tent, everything normal and in its place. But the cold feeling remained. I sat up, intending to check the time on my watch, when I realized something that made my blood freeze. I wasn't in my tent. I was standing outside in the darkness with no memory of how I got there. The beam of my flashlight swept across the campsite. The fire was completely out, not even embers remaining. Dad and Hannah's tents were closed up tight. The trees around us were black silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky. I stood barefoot on the damp ground, wearing just my t-shirt and shorts that I'd slept in, with absolutely no recollection of unzipping my tent, crawling out and standing up. Had I been sleepwalking? I'd never done that before, not once in my entire life. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the campsite. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only illuminated trees and underbrush. Nothing moved. I backed toward my tent, suddenly desperate to be inside it again. As I turned to unzip the flap, my light caught something on the ground. Footprints, my own bare footprints leading from my tent toward the edge of camp, toward the direction of the stone circle. I couldn't fall back asleep after finding myself outside my tent. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those stone circles from yesterday, glowing with blue light, like in my dream. The forest around our campsite stayed quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves, but even those normal sounds kept me on edge. I sat inside my tent with my back against my backpack, knees pulled up to my chest. The flashlight stayed on, casting weird shadows across the orange nylon walls. I wasn't going back out there, not tonight. My watch showed it was almost 3 a.m. when I finally dozed off, slumped awkwardly against my pack. My sleep was thin and restless, full of half-formed dreams about being lost in the woods. A voice yanked me awake. "Paul!" My eyes shot open. The inside of my tent was pitch black. My flashlight had died. I fumbled for it, clicking the button uselessly. "Paul!" The voice came again, clearer this time. It sounded like it was right outside my tent. Female. Soft. Almost a whisper. "Come to me, my child." I froze. That last part sent ice through my veins. My first thought was Hannah playing some stupid joke. She knew I was freaked out yesterday at the stone circle, and this seemed exactly like the kind of thing she'd do to mess with me. "Hannah, cut it out," I hissed, trying to keep my voice down so I wouldn't wake Dad. No response, just the soft sound of the breeze through the trees. I unzipped my sleeping bag and crawled to the tent entrance. My hands shook as I reached for the zipper. The tent fabric rustled as I pulled it open just enough to peek outside. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting everything in a pale blue glow. The campfire had died hours ago, leaving nothing but cold ashes. Dad's tent was dark and still. Hannah's too. "Hannah," I whispered, louder this time. "Paul." The voice came from behind me, from the trees beyond our campsite. I spun around, heart pounding. There was nothing there that I could see, just darkness between the trees. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. I looked back at Hannah's tent. If this was her idea of a joke, she was taking it too far. I grabbed my dead flashlight, it would make a decent club if needed, and crawled out of my tent. The ground felt cold against my bare feet as I crept over to Hannah's tent. "Hannah," I whispered, tapping on the nylon. "Hannah, wake up." No response. I unzipped her tent door just enough to look inside. In the faint moonlight, I could make out her shape in her sleeping bag, her back to me. Her blonde hair spilled across her pillow. Her breathing was deep and regular. "Hannah," I said, louder this time. She stirred and rolled over. "What?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Did you just call my name?" "What? No, go away." She rolled back over and pulled her sleeping bag up over her shoulder. That wasn't fake. She'd been sound asleep. "Paul." The voice came again, from the woods. Hannah didn't react at all. "Did you hear that?" I asked her. "Hear what? Go back to sleep." She didn't even turn around. My mouth went dry. If it wasn't Hannah, then who, or what, was calling my name? I zipped Hannah's tent back up and stood in the center of our campsite, scanning the tree line. The moonlight created weird shadows that seemed to move when I looked directly at them. "Paul, come to me, my child." The voice was clearer now, coming from the direction of the path that led to the stone circle. I took a step toward Dad's tent, thinking about waking him, but stopped. He'd just tell me it was the wind or my imagination, like he did at the stones. I retreated to my tent, zipping it shut behind me. I climbed back into my sleeping bag fully clothed, pulling it up to my chin even though I wasn't cold. I lay there rigid, ears straining for any sound. For what felt like hours, I listened to something moving around our campsite. Soft footsteps circled my tent, pausing occasionally. Once, I swear I felt something press against the fabric near my head. I held my breath, too terrified to move. The voice called my name a few more times, always with that same phrase, "Come to me, my child." Each time, it seemed to come from a different direction, as if whatever it was circled our camp throughout the night. I didn't sleep again. I lay in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open in the darkness, listening to that thing outside until the first gray light of dawn filtered through my tent walls. Only then did the footsteps and the voice finally stop. When I was sure it was morning, I unzipped my tent and crawled outside. The forest looked normal in the early light. Birds chirping, dew on the grass, mist rising from the lake in the distance. If not for the dark circles under my eyes and the knot in my stomach, I might have convinced myself it had all been a nightmare. I stood up and stretched my stiff muscles, looking around the campsite. That's when I saw it. Right in front of my tent entrance, placed so precisely I had almost stepped on it, was a small cloth bag about the size of my palm. It looked handmade, stitched together with rough thread. A thin leather cord tied it shut. I picked it up carefully. It was light, but clearly contained something. With shaking fingers, I untied the cord and opened the bag. Bones. Tiny animal bones, bleached white. They looked like they might belong to a bird or small rodent. Among them was what looked like a tooth, too big to be from whatever the other bones belonged to. My stomach lurched. This wasn't here last night. Someone, or something, had left it while I was in my tent. "Morning." Dad's voice made me jump. He emerged from his tent, stretching his arms above his head. "Sleep well?" I turned to him, holding out the bag. "Dad, look at this." I found it right outside my tent. He took the bag and peered inside, his brow furrowing. Looks like animal bones. "It wasn't there last night," I said, "and I heard something outside, a voice calling my name." Dad poked at the contents of the bag with his finger. Probably just the remains of some animal a predator caught. A fox or owl might have dropped it. Dad, it's in a bag, a handmade bag. Animals don't make bags. He shrugged. Maybe it's something Levi forgot to mention. Could be part of the local wildlife management. They tag and track animals here. That doesn't explain the voice I heard, I insisted. Someone was outside my tent all night calling my name, saying, "Come to me, my child." Dad handed the bag back to me. "Paul, we're miles from anywhere. There's no one else on this island. You probably heard the wind in the trees. Or maybe you were having a nightmare and it seemed real." "I wasn't dreaming," I said, my frustration building. "I was wide awake." Look, the mind plays tricks when you're in an unfamiliar environment. All these new sounds, the darkness, it's easy to misinterpret things. I wanted to argue more, but the look on his face told me it was pointless. He'd already made up his mind that there was a rational explanation. "Fine," I said, stuffing the bag into my pocket. "Whatever." Dad clapped me on the shoulder. "Let's get some breakfast going. I'm thinking pancakes this morning. That'll cheer you up." He walked off toward the fire pit, already moving on like nothing had happened. I stood there, the bag of bones heavy in my pocket, feeling completely alone despite having my family right there with me. Hannah emerged from her tent a while later, her hair a mess and her eyes still puffy with sleep. She sat on the log across from me while Dad flipped pancakes on the camp stove. "You look awful," she said, staring at me. "Thanks," I muttered. "Seriously, did you sleep at all?" I glanced at Dad, who was humming to himself as he cooked. "Not really." "Didn't you hear anything last night?" She shook her head. "I slept like the dead." Poor choice of words. I almost showed her the bag of bones, but decided against it. She'd probably just side with Dad and tell me I was being dramatic. The day dragged on. Dad wanted to go back to the stone circle to take rubbings of the carvings, but I flat out refused. After some argument, he agreed we could stay closer to camp today. Hannah retreated to her tent with her e-reader, and Dad went fishing off the rocks by the lake. I spent the day in a fog of exhaustion and anxiety, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound from the forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed different somehow, quieter. The birds that had been so noisy our first day were mostly silent now. Even the insects seemed to have hushed. The trees themselves felt like they were leaning in toward our camp, closing in around us. Hannah barely spoke all day. When she did come out of her tent, she seemed distant, distracted. Once, I caught her staring into the forest, toward the path that led to the stone circle. When I asked what she was looking at, she just shrugged and went back to her tent. As the afternoon wore on, I felt a growing sense of dread about the coming night. The sun began its descent, shadows lengthening across our campsite. Dad built up the fire bigger than the previous nights, which gave me some small comfort. "Beautiful sunset," Dad said, gazing at the orange and pink sky visible through gaps in the trees. "This is what camping is all about." I nodded absently, my eyes fixed on the darkening forest. In a few hours, the sun would be gone completely, and whatever had visited me last night might return. Dad handed me a plate of beans and hot dogs for dinner. I wasn't hungry, but forced myself to eat. I needed to stay alert tonight. "You're awfully quiet today," Dad said. "Still upset about that bag of bones?" "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired." He studied me for a moment. "You know, when I was your age, I went camping with my dad in the Cascades. First night, I was convinced I heard a bear outside my tent. Kept me up all night. Turned out to be a raccoon knocking over our trash." "This wasn't a raccoon, Dad." He sighed. "I'm just saying the forest plays tricks on you, especially at night. Don't let your imagination run wild." The sun dipped below the tree line. Darkness crept in around us, held at bay only by our campfire. Hannah retreated to her tent early, mumbling something about finishing her book. Dad stayed up with me by the fire, telling stories about his previous camping trips that I barely listened to. My eyes kept drifting to the forest, searching the darkness between the trees. The night seemed to press in around us, the circle of firelight growing smaller. Each crack of a twig or rustle of leaves sent a jolt through me. Eventually, Dad yawned and stretched. "Think I'll turn in. Don't stay up too late, okay? And make sure you put the fire out properly." I nodded, not trusting my voice. He gave my shoulder a squeeze before heading to his tent, and then I was alone. The fire popped and crackled. Beyond its light, the forest waited. I added another log to the flames, watching the sparks rise into the night sky. The stars were out, countless pinpricks of light in the vast darkness above. I didn't want to go to my tent. I didn't want to lie there in the dark, waiting for that voice to call my name again. But I couldn't stay by the fire all night either. My eyes burned with exhaustion. I needed sleep. But more than that, I needed to know what was out there in the woods. What had left that bag of bones? What had called my name in that soft, chilling voice? As the fire began to die down, I made my decision. I'd go to my tent, but I wouldn't sleep. I'd wait. And if it came back, I'd be ready. I doused the fire carefully with water from our canteen, watching the flames hiss and die. Darkness swallowed the campsite. I turned on my backup flashlight. I'd found fresh batteries in my backpack and made my way to my tent. Inside, I sat with my back against my pack again, facing the tent door. The flashlight lay beside me, its beam pointing at the entrance. I had my pocket knife open on my lap, though what good it would do against whatever was out there I didn't know. The forest grew quieter as the night deepened. My eyelids felt heavy, but every time they started to close, I forced them open again. I checked my watch. Midnight. The hour when it had started last night. I fought against exhaustion with every blink. The pocket knife in my hand felt heavier by the minute, and my eyes burned from staring at the tent entrance for so long. I checked my watch again. Midnight exactly. The hour when it all started last night. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no night birds, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. Just dead quiet. I shifted my position, legs cramping from sitting cross-legged for hours. My dad's dismissive attitude about the bone bag still bothered me. How could he not see something weird was happening? Hannah, too, acting like I was making it all up. The bone bag sat heavy in my pocket, a tangible reminder I wasn't crazy. A twig snapped outside. I froze, gripping my flashlight tighter. Another snap, closer this time. Something was walking toward my tent. "Hello?" I whispered, immediately regretting making any sound at all. The footsteps stopped. Then came a sound that made my skin crawl. A slow, deliberate scratching against the outside of my tent, like fingernails dragging across the fabric. I pointed my flashlight at the wall where the sound came from, but the beam only showed the shadow of something moving outside. The scratching continued, circling around to the front of the tent. Then I heard it. A voice, but not like last night. This one was deeper, gravelly, like someone speaking through a throat full of dirt. "My child," it rasped. "Come to me, my child." I couldn't breathe. The voice wasn't coming from all around like before. It was right outside my tent. The zipper of my tent began to move, pulling upward by itself. I scrambled backward until I hit the far wall of the tent. The entrance opened just enough for me to see outside. There, at the edge of our campsite, stood a figure. It was a girl, or what used to be a girl. She wore a tattered white dress that hung in dirty strips from her skeletal frame. Her skin was gray and peeling in patches, showing darker flesh underneath. Her hair hung in clumps, matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. But her face was the worst part. Where her eyes should have been were just empty sockets, dark and hollow, yet somehow I could feel them looking at me. "My child," she said again, her mouth barely moving, jaw hanging slightly askew. "Come to me." I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I just stared, knife forgotten in my lap, flashlight beam shaking wildly in my trembling hand. She took a step forward, one bare foot dragging behind the other. The smell hit me then, like roadkill left in the summer sun for days. "Dad!" I finally managed to yell, my voice cracking. "Dad!" I blinked and she was gone, just gone. The space where she stood was empty. The flap of my dad's tent unzipped and his head poked out, hair messy from sleep. "What? What is it?" he asked, annoyed and groggy. There was... I pointed to where she'd been standing. There was a girl, right there, in a white dress. She wasn't alive, Dad. He sighed and climbed out of his tent, pulling on his boots. "Paul, we've been over this. There's nobody else on this island. I'm not making this up." My voice came out louder than I intended. She was right there. She said, "Come to me, my child." The same thing I heard last night. Dad walked over to where I'd pointed, sweeping his flashlight across the ground. "There's nothing here, Paul. No footprints except ours." I crawled to my tent entrance, looking at the dirt. He was right. The ground showed no sign of the girl. "But I saw her," I insisted. "She had no eyes, Dad. Just empty sockets, and she smelled like something dead." Hannah's tent rustled and she stuck her head out. "What's going on?" "Your brother had another nightmare," Dad said. "It wasn't a nightmare. I was awake the whole time." Hannah rolled her eyes. "Can you guys keep it down? Some of us are trying to sleep." "Go back to sleep, Hannah," Dad said. He turned to me with a look that was more worried than angry. "Paul, listen. I think you're overtired. You barely slept last night, and now your mind is playing tricks on you." "I know what I saw," I said, my voice getting smaller. Dad rubbed his face. "Look, there's nothing out there. We're alone on this island. If it makes you feel better, I'll stay up for a bit and keep watch." "You don't believe me." "I believe you think you saw something," he said carefully. "But sometimes, when we're scared and tired, our brains fill in the blanks with the worst possible things." I wanted to argue more, but what was the point? He wouldn't believe me unless he saw her himself. The isolation crushed me. I was completely alone with this thing, whatever it was. "Fine," I said, retreating back into my tent and zipping it closed. I sat there in the dark, listening to Dad move around outside for a few minutes before he went back to his tent. Hannah had already gone quiet. I was alone again. I must have dozed off despite my fear because I jerked awake to that same gravelly voice right outside my tent. "My child, I'm waiting." I scrambled for my flashlight and knife, heart hammering in my chest. The smell hit me before I could even turn on the light. That putrid, rotting odor seeping through the tent walls. When I finally got the flashlight on, I saw her silhouette against the tent fabric, closer now, almost touching the outside of my tent. Her fingers, long and skeletal, pressed against the nylon, creating small indentations that moved slowly across the wall. I couldn't stay in here. I couldn't be alone with this thing any longer. I unzipped my tent with shaking hands and burst outside, running straight for my dad's tent without looking back. "Dad!" I yelled, unzipping his tent without asking. "Dad, she's back!" He sat up quickly, disoriented. "What? Paul, what are you—" "She's right outside my tent." I was shaking uncontrollably now. "Please, you have to believe me." Dad grabbed his flashlight and climbed out of his tent, me right behind him. He swept the light around the campsite, lingering on my tent, which stood undisturbed. "There's nothing there, Paul. She was just here. You have to have seen her, smelled her at least. She smells like death." Dad put his hands on my shoulders. "Paul, listen to me. There's nobody here but us." "Then what's happening to me?" My voice broke. Am I going crazy? Why am I seeing her? Dad's face softened. You're not crazy. You're just stressed. This trip, being away from everything familiar, it can mess with your head. But the bag of bones could be from anything. Maybe some animal researcher tagged something and it fell off. I pulled away from him. Stop making excuses. Something is happening here, and you won't even consider it. Hannah's head poked out of her tent again. Seriously? Again? Go back to sleep, Hannah, Dad said firmly. She muttered something and disappeared back inside. Dad looked at me for a long moment. Do you want to sleep in my tent tonight? The offer surprised me. It was something he might have suggested when I was 8, not 17. But right then I didn't care how childish it seemed. Yes, I admitted. Dad nodded. Okay, get your sleeping bag. I hesitated, not wanting to go back to my tent. Dad seemed to understand and went to get it for me. I stood in the middle of the campsite, turning in slow circles, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. Once inside Dad's tent, I set up my sleeping bag as far from the entrance as possible, pressing myself against the back wall. Dad got into his own bag without saying much, just a gruff, try to get some sleep. I lay there, wide awake, listening to Dad's breathing as it gradually slowed into sleep. The tent felt safer than mine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting. Every few minutes I heard subtle movements outside, the soft press of feet on dirt, the gentle brush of fabric against leaves. Occasionally, a waft of that putrid smell would seep through the tent walls, making me gag silently. I pressed myself harder against the tent wall, as if I could somehow disappear through it if she came in. My mind raced through possibilities. Was I hallucinating? Having some kind of breakdown? Or was this thing, this dead girl, actually real? If she was real, why couldn't anyone else see her? Why was she only coming for me? The question circled in my head as I lay rigid in my sleeping bag, knife clutched in one hand, listening to the soft scratching sounds that moved around the tent all night long. I woke with a start, my neck stiff from sleeping upright against Dad's tent wall. Light filtered through the nylon walls, casting everything in a pale yellow glow. I'd finally dozed off sometime before dawn after the longest night of my life. "Dad?" I called out, my voice rough from exhaustion. No answer. I blinked hard, trying to clear the fog from my brain. Dad's sleeping bag lay empty beside me, neatly zipped up. He must have gotten up early again to make breakfast. The thought brought a small measure of relief. Maybe in daylight, with food in my stomach, last night's horrors would seem less real. I unzipped the tent and crawled out, wincing as my stiff muscles protested. "Dad?" I called again, louder this time. The campsite was empty. The fire pit contained only cold ashes. Hannah's tent remained zipped shut. I checked my watch, 7:30 in the morning. Dad was always up by 6, but usually had a fire going by now. I walked toward the lake, thinking he might be filling water bottles or trying his luck with early morning fishing. Nothing but still water reflecting the cloudy sky. Something felt wrong. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. I jogged back to Dad's tent, thinking I'd missed something. His hiking boots were gone, but his backpack remained. Maybe he'd just gone for a short walk. That's when I saw it, right where his head would have been while sleeping. Another small cloth bag, identical to the one I'd found outside my tent yesterday. My stomach dropped as I picked it up with trembling fingers. Same rough fabric, same leather cord binding it closed. I already knew what I'd find inside before I opened it. More small animal bones, bleached white. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "No, no, no." I stumbled out of the tent, the bone bag clutched in my fist. This couldn't be happening. Dad had to be nearby. He had to be. "Dad!" I screamed, my voice echoing across the lake, birds scattered from nearby trees. "Dad! Where are you?" Hannah's tent unzipped, and she poked her head out, hair tangled from sleep, eyes narrowed with annoyance. "What are you yelling about?" she asked. "Some of us are trying to sleep." "Dad's gone," I said, my voice shaking. "He's not here." Hannah rolled her eyes. "He probably went fishing or something. You know how he is." "No." I held up the bone bag. "I found this where he was sleeping. It's like the one I found yesterday. He's gone, Hannah." Her expression shifted from irritation to confusion. "What is that thing?" "It's what I've been trying to tell you guys about. The same kind of bag I found outside my tent yesterday. Dad's gone, and this was left in his place." Hannah crawled out of her tent, pulling her hoodie tighter around her. "That doesn't make any sense. Did you check by the lake?" "Yes, I checked the lake. He's not there. His boots are gone, but his backpack is still here." I was trying to keep my voice steady, but panic was rising in my throat like bile. Hannah stood up, finally seeming to grasp the seriousness of the situation. "Maybe he went to that stone circle you guys found. You said he wanted to go back there. Without telling us? Without taking his backpack or supplies?" I shook my head. "Something's wrong, really wrong." Hannah pulled on her sneakers. "Let's look for him. He can't have gone far." For the next hour, we searched the immediate area around our campsite, calling Dad's name until our voices grew hoarse. We checked the path to the lake, the surrounding forest, and even a small clearing we'd found on our first day. Nothing. No sign of him anywhere. "We need to check the stone circle," I finally said, dreading the idea but knowing we had to. "He might have gone there." Hannah nodded, her face pale. "Okay. Let me grab my water bottle." We set out along the path we'd taken yesterday, me leading the way with Hannah close behind. The forest seemed different today. Quieter, more watchful. The trees blocked most of the gray morning light, creating a perpetual twilight beneath their canopy. "Dad!" I called every few minutes. "Dad, can you hear us?" Each time my voice seemed to die in the thick air, absorbed by the moss and ferns and ancient trees. "This is so weird," Hannah said after we'd been walking for 20 minutes. "He wouldn't just leave without saying anything." I know. I didn't want to tell her about the girl I'd seen, about the voice that had been calling to me for 2 nights. I didn't want to frighten her more than she already was. But the dread in my stomach was growing with each step we took. "What if he fell and got hurt?" Hannah asked, her voice smaller now. "What if he can't call back?" "Then we'll find him," I said, with more confidence than I felt. "That's why we're looking." We reached the dense underbrush that marked the approach to the stone circle. I hesitated, remembering the pale movement I'd glimpsed between the stones yesterday, the whispered voices when I'd touched the carvings. "It's through here," I said, pushing aside branches to create a path for Hannah. We emerged into the clearing, and there they were, 7 tall stones arranged in a perfect circle just as we'd left them. The grass inside the circle seemed even shorter today, almost as if it had been recently trampled. "Dad," Hannah called, her voice echoing strangely among the stones. No answer but the wind. I scanned the clearing, looking for any sign of our father, a footprint, a piece of clothing, anything. Nothing obvious stood out. I circled the perimeter, examining the ground. "He's not here," Hannah said, stating the obvious. Where else could he have gone? I shook my head, the knot in my stomach tightening. I don't know, but we need to keep looking. We spent the next several hours searching in ever-widening circles from our camp, calling until our voices were raw. We followed every path we could find, checked every clearing, and even made our way to the northern shore where Dad had wanted to take us. No sign of him anywhere. By mid-afternoon, we returned to camp, exhausted and increasingly frightened. Hannah sat on a log by the cold fire pit, her face drawn. "What do we do now?" she asked. I paced in front of her, trying to think. "Levi's coming back tomorrow at 4. If we can't find Dad by then, we'll have to tell him what happened." But what about tonight? What if Dad doesn't come back before dark? The thought of spending another night on this island, especially without Dad, made my skin crawl. But we had no choice. We'll stay in the same tent tonight, I decided. We'll keep a fire going all night. Dad will see it if he's lost and trying to find his way back. Hannah nodded, looking relieved at not having to sleep alone. I'm scared, Paul, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I sat beside her on the log, putting my arm around her shoulders. Me too, but we're going to be okay. Dad's smart. He knows this island better than we do. She leaned against me, and for a moment, we were just kids again, seeking comfort in each other like we used to when we were little and thunder would shake our house. What if something bad happened to him? She whispered. I thought about the bone bags, the pale girl in the tattered dress, the voice that had called to me for 2 nights. I thought about Dad dismissing everything I'd told him, insisting it was just my imagination. I don't know, I answered honestly, but we'll figure it out. As the afternoon wore on, we gathered firewood, built a fire, and heated water for our freeze-dried meals. Neither of us was hungry, but we needed to keep our strength up. We ate in silence, the weight of Dad's absence hanging over us like a physical thing. The sky darkened earlier than usual, heavy clouds blocking what little sun had managed to break through during the day. I kept glancing toward the forest, half expecting Dad to emerge at any moment with some perfectly reasonable explanation for his disappearance. He didn't. As darkness settled around us, I built the fire higher, using larger logs that would burn through the night. Hannah sat close to the flames, her knees pulled up to her chest. I keep thinking about what Dad would do if it was one of us missing, she said, staring into the fire. He'd tear the island apart looking for us, I replied. Which is exactly what we did today. Yeah. She poked at the fire with a stick. He wouldn't give up. Neither will we. But as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that our search had been futile from the start. Whatever had taken Dad, whether it was the pale girl or something else, wasn't going to let him be found so easily. Night fell completely, bringing with it a heavy silence. No crickets chirped, no frogs called from the lake. Just the crackling of our fire and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. We should get some sleep, I said eventually, though I doubted either of us would manage much. We'll start searching again at first light. Hannah nodded, her face ghostly in the firelight. Okay. I helped her move her sleeping bag into Dad's tent, which was larger than mine. We left the fire burning bright, hoping it might guide Dad back if he was lost in the woods. Inside the tent, we lay side by side, staring up at the nylon ceiling. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Paul? Hannah finally whispered. Yeah? You know something, don't you? Something about what happened to Dad. I swallowed hard. What do you mean? You've been acting weird ever since we got here, like you're seeing things the rest of us aren't. And now Dad's gone and you found that weird bag of bones, and you're not even surprised. It's like you expected this to happen. I turned to look at her, barely able to make out her features in the darkness. I tried to tell you guys. I tried to tell Dad, but neither of you would listen. Tell us what? I took a deep breath. There's something on this island. Something not natural. Something not natural. I've seen it, heard it, for the past 2 nights. Hannah shifted to face me in the darkness. What are you talking about? A girl, or something that looks like a girl. She's been coming to my tent at night, calling my name. The words tumbled out now that I'd finally started. She looks dead, Hannah. Gray skin, matted hair with dried blood and no eyes, just empty sockets. She keeps saying, "Come to me, my child," over and over. Hannah was silent for so long I thought she might have fallen asleep. Then she whispered, "That's not funny, Paul." I'm not joking. I showed Dad the first bone bag yesterday morning. He said it was probably dropped by an animal, but animals don't make little cloth bags tied with leather cords. Then last night she came back. I saw her clearly. Dad didn't believe me. He thought I was having nightmares or hallucinating from stress. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the bone bag I'd found in Dad's tent. And now he's gone, and this was left where he was sleeping. Hannah sat up, turning on her flashlight to look at the bag in my hand. You think this dead girl took Dad? I don't know. Maybe. I sat up too, running a hand through my hair. I know how it sounds, but I'm not making this up, Hannah. I'm not crazy. She stared at the bone bag, her face unreadable in the harsh flashlight beam. If what you're saying is true, why would it take Dad and not you? It was calling your name, right? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Why had it taken Dad instead of me? Was it my fault? Had Dad been taken because of me somehow? I don't know, I admitted, guilt washing over me. Maybe because I ran to his tent last night when it came back? Maybe it followed me there? Hannah switched off the flashlight, plunging us back into darkness. This is insane, Paul. Dead girls don't take people. I know what I saw, I insisted. And Dad is gone. Those two things have to be connected. We lapsed into silence again. The fire crackled outside, sending shifting shadows across the tent walls. Every sound from the forest made me tense, wondering if she was coming back. We need to sleep, Hannah finally said. We can't help Dad if we're exhausted. You sleep, I told her. I'll keep watch. Paul. I'm not taking any chances, Hannah. Not after what happened to Dad. She didn't argue further, just curled up in her sleeping bag with her back to me. Within 20 minutes, her breathing had slowed and deepened into sleep. I sat with my back against my backpack, flashlight in one hand, pocket knife in the other, watching the tent entrance. Hours passed. The fire outside gradually dimmed as the larger logs burned down. The forest remained eerily silent. No owls, no rustling of nocturnal animals, nothing. Just dead silence. My thoughts kept circling back to Dad. Where was he now? Was he still alive? Had the girl taken him to the stone circle? The questions gnawed at me along with a growing sense of guilt. If I had somehow attracted this thing to our camp, then Dad's disappearance was my fault. Around midnight, a decision crystallized in my mind. I needed to go back to the stone circle, alone. Hannah would be safer here at camp, and I couldn't risk whatever had taken Dad coming for her too. The stone circle was where this had all started, where I'd first heard the whispers, where I'd first felt that something was wrong with this island. If there were answers to be found, they'd be there. I looked at Hannah, sleeping soundly in her exhaustion. I couldn't wake her. She'd never let me go alone, and I couldn't put her in danger. I carefully slipped out of my sleeping bag and wrote a quick note on a page torn from Dad's waterproof notepad. Gone to look for Dad. Stay here. I'll be back. 'Tis P. I placed it where she would see it if she woke up, then gathered my essentials. Flashlight, pocket knife, water bottle, and the bone bag. I didn't know why, but something told me I should bring it. Exiting the tent as quietly as possible, I zipped it closed behind me. The campfire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see the immediate area. The rest of the world was shrouded in darkness. I switched on my flashlight and took a deep breath. The beam seemed feeble against the wall of darkness surrounding our camp. Every instinct screamed at me to go back inside the tent, to wait for morning, to wait for Levi to return tomorrow. But Dad didn't have that kind of time. I knew it with a certainty I couldn't explain. The path to the stone circle was harder to follow in the dark. My flashlight beam bounced off trees and undergrowth, creating disorienting shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The forest felt alive around me, watching, waiting. "I'm coming, Dad," I whispered, partly to comfort myself with the sound of a human voice. "Just hold on." The deeper I went into the forest, the colder the air became. My breath fogged in front of me, despite it being summer. The silence pressed against my ears like a physical thing, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps and ragged breathing. When I reached the dense underbrush that marked the approach to the stone circle, I hesitated. What exactly was I planning to do? Confront a supernatural entity that had already taken my father? The idea was absurd, suicidal even. But I couldn't turn back now. Dad would never have abandoned us. If there was any chance he was still alive, I had to try. I pushed through the undergrowth, branches scratching at my face and arms. When I emerged into the clearing, the stone circle stood just as before, 7 tall monoliths silhouetted against the night sky. But something was different. The air inside the circle seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat rising from pavement on a hot day. "Dad?" I called, my voice sounding thin and weak in the oppressive silence. "Are you here?" No answer. I stepped closer to the circle, playing my flashlight beam across each stone in turn. The carvings seemed deeper somehow, more defined. When the light hit them, they appeared to shift slightly, as if alive. "I know you're here," I said, louder now, addressing not my father, but whatever had taken him. "I know you took my dad. Bring him back." The wind picked up suddenly, whispering through the trees surrounding the clearing. It almost sounded like voices, like the whispers I'd heard when I first touched the stone. "Come to me, my child." I spun around but saw nothing. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Where's my dad?" I demanded, fear giving way to anger. "What did you do with him?" The wind died as suddenly as it had risen, leaving an unnatural stillness. My flashlight flickered once, twice, then steadied. I gripped it tighter, my palms slick with sweat. I took another step toward the circle, stopping just at its edge. The short grass inside the circle looked almost blue in the flashlight beam, like it was frosted over despite the summer night. "Dad!" I called one more time, desperation creeping into my voice. "Dad, if you can hear me, answer me." Only silence answered. I stood at the edge of the stone circle, the boundary between the normal world and whatever lay beyond. My father was somewhere on the other side of that line. I was certain of it now. And whatever had taken him wanted me too. The realization should have sent me running back to camp, back to Hannah and the relative safety of our tent. But I couldn't leave Dad to whatever fate awaited him. I couldn't abandon him like he would never have abandoned us. I pulled the bone bag from my pocket and held it up. "You want me. Here I am. But I want my father back first." The air shimmered more intensely now, rippling like water. My flashlight beam seemed to bend as it passed through the edge of the circle, distorting everything beyond. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Hannah was safe back at camp. Levi would come tomorrow whether we signaled or not. If I didn't return, he would find Hannah and get her off this island. She would be okay. With that thought firmly in mind, I stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the stone circle. Whatever waited for me there, whatever had taken my father, I was ready to face it. I had no choice. Dad's life depended on it. As darkness closed around me, I felt a cold certainty settle in my bones. I might not leave this circle alive, but I wouldn't leave without my father, no matter what it cost me personally. I stepped all the way into the stone circle, following the trail of small white bones that led away from my father's crumpled jacket. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the ancient stones that surrounded me. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects chirping, no leaves rustling, not even the sound of wind. Just my own breathing and the soft crunch of dirt beneath my feet. "I know you're here," I said, my voice sounding thin and small in the clearing. "I know you took my dad." No answer came, but I felt a change in the air, a heaviness, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I swept my flashlight around the circle again, seeing nothing but the stones with their weathered carvings, the scattered bones, and the empty darkness between them. "What do you want?" I called out, clutching the emergency radio tighter in my hand. "Why are you doing this?" A soft sound came from behind me. Not quite a footstep, more like fabric dragging across the ground. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the clearing until it landed on the space between two of the tall stones. The air there seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Then she appeared. She didn't step out from behind the stones or emerge from the forest. One second there was nothing, and the next she stood there, the girl in the tattered white dress. Up close I could see that what I'd thought was gray, peeling skin was actually more like dried mud caked over her entire body, cracking in places to reveal pale flesh underneath. Her hair hung in matted clumps, dark with what looked like dried blood. And her eyes, those empty sockets, seemed to stare right at me despite their emptiness. My throat closed up. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, but my legs wouldn't move. The flashlight trembled in my hand, its beam shaking across her grotesque form. "My child," she said, her voice that same gravelly whisper I'd heard outside my tent. Her mouth barely moved when she spoke, her jaw hanging at an odd angle. "Come to me, my child." She took a step toward me, dragging one foot behind her like it was injured. The putrid smell I'd noticed before grew stronger, the smell of something long dead. "Where's my dad?" I managed to ask, my voice cracking. "What did you do to him?" She took another dragging step forward. "Come to me." I backed up until I felt one of the tall stones behind me, cold and unyielding against my back. The girl kept coming, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with tangled strings. "Stay away from me," I said, holding up the flashlight like it might protect me somehow. "Tell me where my dad is." She paused, tilting her head at an impossible angle, studying me. Then she raised one arm, pointing toward the center of the circle where my father's jacket lay. "Did you hurt him?" My voice was barely a whisper now. "My child," she repeated, but this time the words sounded different, almost sad. "Come to me, my child." She started moving again, closing the distance between us. I pressed myself harder against the stone, feeling the rough carvings dig into my back through my shirt. The radio slipped from my sweaty hand, landing with a soft thud at my feet. When she was just a few feet away, I noticed something change in her face. The menacing look I'd seen before shifted into something else, something almost mournful. Her head tilted to the other side, and a sound came from her that wasn't words, more like a soft, keening moan. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't look away as she reached toward me with one hand. Her fingers were bone-thin, the nails long and cracked, caked with dirt or blood or both. "Please," I whispered, not even sure what I was begging for. Her cold hand touched my cheek, and the world exploded into fragments. Images flashed through my mind so fast I couldn't make sense of them at first. The island seen from above, the stone circle new and unmarked, people in old-fashioned clothes walking through the forest. Then the images slowed, and I saw children. A boy in clothes that looked like they were from the 50s. A girl in a dress from maybe 100 years ago. Others in clothing from times I couldn't place. All of them walking into the stone circle. All of them vanishing. I saw the pale girl as she might have been once. Alive, with dark eyes and clean hair, wearing the white dress when it was new. I felt her fear, her confusion, her anger. I sensed she was trying to tell me something important about the island, about the stones, about herself. The stones. They were more than they appeared. Both a prison and a doorway. And she was both prisoner and jailer, victim and predator, trapped in an endless cycle of hunger and loneliness. The visions became more chaotic. Flashes of my father walking into the circle at night, the girl approaching him, his fear, his struggle, then darkness. I felt sick, dizzy, like I was falling even though I knew I was standing still. Through the confusion of images, one thought came through clearly. She was trying to show me something. Something about what she was, what the island was. Something I needed to understand. The cold hand left my cheek and I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. My vision cleared for just a moment, and I looked up to see her standing over me, those empty eye sockets fixed on mine. Behind her, illuminated by my dropped flashlight, I could see my father's jacket clearly now, lying among scattered bones that looked too large to belong to animals. My stomach lurched. Dad! Those were my dad's bones. He was... Darkness rushed in from all sides, and I felt myself falling backward. The last thing I saw before consciousness left me completely was the pale girl reaching toward me again, her mouth open in what might have been a scream or a plea. But no sound reached my ears as the world went black. I woke to a hand on my shoulder and someone calling my name. Not the whispered, raspy voice from the stone circle, but a man's voice. "Kid? Hey, kid, can you hear me?" My eyes felt glued shut. When I pried them open, sunlight stabbed through tree branches above me. I was still in the stone circle, lying flat on my back on cold ground. My head throbbed like someone had taken a hammer to it. "He's conscious," the voice said to someone else. Got a response. I tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The world tilted sideways and my stomach lurched. A man in a dark green uniform crouched next to me. Forest Service or park ranger, judging by the patches on his sleeve. Behind him stood Levi, the float plane pilot who dropped us off. "Take it easy," the ranger said, putting a hand on my chest to keep me down. "You've been out here all night from the looks of it." "My dad," I mumbled, my mouth dry as sandpaper. "Did you find my dad?" The ranger and Levi exchanged a look I couldn't read. "We're looking," the ranger said. "I'm Axel Wilson, head ranger for this district. Levi here came early when he couldn't reach your family on the radio. Lucky he did." I struggled to make sense of what was happening. The memories of last night rushed back. The pale girl, the visions, my father's jacket, the bones. I tried again to sit up, this time more slowly. "The girl," I said, my voice cracking. "Did you see her? The girl in the white dress?" Ranger Wilson's expression shifted subtly. "Let's get you back to camp first. There's a paramedic there who needs to check you out." Levi helped me to my feet. My legs felt like they were made of rubber, and my head spun. I looked around the stone circle, searching for any sign of what had happened. The bone trail, my father's jacket, the flashlight I'd dropped. The morning sunlight made everything look ordinary, almost peaceful. Just ancient stones in a clearing. "Where's my dad's jacket?" I asked. It was right there, and the bones. There were bones. "We need to get you back to camp," Ranger Wilson said firmly, taking my arm. "Your sister's worried sick." The walk back to camp passed in a blur. I kept trying to tell them what happened, but my thoughts were jumbled, and neither man seemed particularly interested in listening. They supported me between them when I stumbled, guiding me along the path that seemed much shorter in daylight. The campsite had transformed. 2 additional rangers in uniform moved about methodically, documenting everything with cameras and notepads. A woman in a paramedic uniform knelt beside Hannah, who sat wrapped in a blanket on a fallen log near the fire pit. When she saw me, Hannah jumped up and ran over, throwing her arms around me. "You idiot," she said into my shoulder, her voice muffled. "You promised you'd come back." "I'm sorry," I said, patting her back awkwardly. "I found Dad's jacket and then I saw—" "Let's get you checked out first," interrupted the paramedic, approaching us with a medical bag. She was maybe in her early 30s, with black hair pulled back in a tight bun and rectangular glasses. "I'm Willow Crawford. Can you sit down for me?" I allowed myself to be led to the log Hannah had vacated. The paramedic, Willow, checked my pupils with a penlight, took my pulse, and wrapped a blood pressure cuff around my arm. I tried to focus, but my attention kept drifting to the rangers conferring in low voices near my father's tent. "Your vitals are stable, but you're dehydrated," Willow said, handing me a water bottle. "Drink this slowly. How's your head? Any dizziness? Nausea?" I nodded, then winced at the movement. "Both. And my head hurts. Possible mild concussion," she noted, writing something on a small pad. "Do you remember hitting your head?" "No, I trailed off, trying to piece together what had happened after the girl touched me. I think I just collapsed. After the visions." Willow paused her writing. "Visions?" Before I could explain, Ranger Wilson approached and crouched in front of me. His weathered face was serious, his blue eyes sharp under bushy eyebrows. "Paul, I need to ask you some questions about your father," he said. "When was the last time you saw him?" I took a sip of water, trying to organize my thoughts. "Yesterday morning. I woke up in his tent and he was gone. His boots were still there, but he was gone." I pulled the bone bag from my pocket. "I found this on his sleeping bag." I held out the small cloth bag tied with leather cord. Ranger Wilson took it carefully, untied it, and peered inside. His expression remained neutral as he examined the small white bones. "And you're certain these weren't there the night before?" he asked. "Yes. I mean, there was another one just like it outside my tent the day before, but this one was new. It was on his sleeping bag." Wilson nodded and placed the bag in a clear plastic evidence pouch he pulled from his pocket. "And after you discovered he was missing, what did you and your sister do?" I explained how we'd searched the island all day, ending up at the stone circle where I found my father's jacket and the trail of bones. Hannah sat beside me now, staring at her hands. "And that's when you sent Hannah back to camp and stayed in the circle?" Wilson asked. "Yes, I thought whatever took Dad was there. And I was right." I leaned forward, desperate to make him understand. "There's a girl, or something that looks like a girl. She's been coming to our camp at night. She has no eyes, just empty sockets, and her skin is all gray and peeling. She wears this torn white dress, and she smells like death." Wilson's face remained impassive, but I caught the quick glance he exchanged with Willow. "And you believe this girl took your father?" he asked carefully. "I know she did. I saw it. When she touched me, I saw visions. I saw Dad in the circle with her, and then just darkness. And the bones." I swallowed hard. I think they were his bones. Hannah made a small, distressed sound beside me. Wilson put a hand on my shoulder. "Paul, I understand you've been through something traumatic. We're going to do everything we can to find your father. We have teams coming in by helicopter within the hour, and they'll conduct a thorough search of the entire island. But I'm telling you what happened," I insisted, my voice rising. "She's not human. She's something else. She's been stalking us since we got here." "Your sister mentioned you haven't been sleeping well," Willow said gently. "She said you've been having nightmares and thought you saw things at night." I turned to Hannah, who wouldn't meet my eyes. "You know I wasn't making it up. I showed you the bone bags. You heard me talking to Dad about it." "I just know you've been really stressed," Hannah said quietly. "And you barely slept for 2 nights." "Did you tell them about the jacket?" I asked her. "About the bones in the circle?" Hannah shook her head. "There wasn't anything there when I went back with the rangers this morning. Just empty ground." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "That's not possible. I saw it. You saw the jacket too." "I saw something on the ground," Hannah admitted. "It was getting dark. I don't know what it was." Over the next hour, more personnel arrived. 2 search and rescue teams deployed into the forest with tracking dogs. A forensic technician photographed and cataloged our campsite. Ranger Wilson continued questioning me, his tone remaining professional but increasingly skeptical as I insisted on what I'd seen. "Let's talk about these stone circles," Wilson said, consulting his notes. "Your father mentioned them to Levi before your trip. They're a known archaeological site on the island, believed to be ceremonial structures used by indigenous peoples hundreds of years ago." "There's something wrong with them," I said. "Something not natural." "Many people feel uncomfortable around ancient sites," Wilson said. "It's a common psychological response to places with historical significance, especially those associated with ritual practices." "This wasn't psychological," I insisted. "The carvings on the stones glowed blue in my dream, and the girl—" "Let's talk about your physical state," Willow interrupted, checking my blood pressure again. "Have you eaten anything unusual while on the island? Any wild plants, berries, mushrooms?" I shook my head. "Just the food we brought." "Your campfire," she continued. "Was it properly ventilated? Carbon monoxide from poorly ventilated fires can cause hallucinations, confusion, even blackouts." "Our fire was fine," I said through gritted teeth. "Dad knows how to build a proper fire." "What about your water source?" she asked. "Some algae blooms can produce neurotoxins." With each question, I felt my story being systematically dismantled, each supernatural element replaced with a rational scientific explanation. Stress-induced hallucinations, sleep deprivation, environmental toxins, trauma response. By midday, the search teams returned with no sign of my father. No footprints, no clothing fibers, no disturbances in the underbrush that would indicate someone had passed through. The dogs had found nothing to track. "We're expanding the search perimeter," Wilson told us. "But I need to be honest with you both. This island isn't that large. If your father were simply lost or injured, we should have found some trace of him by now." "Because he's not lost," I said, my voice hollow. "I told you what happened." Wilson sighed. "Paul, I understand you believe what you're saying, but we deal in evidence, and right now, all the evidence points to your father wandering off for unknown reasons. People sometimes do unpredictable things in wilderness settings, especially if they're disoriented or confused." "He wasn't confused," I snapped. "He was taken." "By a supernatural entity that only you have seen," Wilson said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "An entity that left no physical evidence except small bags of animal bones that could have been placed by anyone, including wildlife researchers who frequent this island." "What about the jacket? What about the human bones I saw?" "We've found no jacket, no human remains, and no sign of violence or struggle anywhere on this island," Wilson stated firmly. "What we have found is a teenager who, by his own admission, has barely slept in 3 days, who has been under significant stress, and who was found unconscious in a location known to induce strong psychological responses in some visitors." I wanted to scream. Instead, I buried my face in my hands, fighting back tears of frustration and fear. Hannah placed a tentative hand on my back. "We're going to keep looking," she said softly. "They'll find him." But I knew they wouldn't. Not alive, anyway. By late afternoon, a decision was made to airlift Hannah and me to the mainland hospital for evaluation. The search would continue without us, with additional personnel arriving to conduct a more comprehensive sweep of the island. As we walked toward the clearing where the helicopter waited, I looked back at our campsite one last time. 3 empty tents, a cold fire pit. No sign that anything supernatural had ever happened. "The bone bags," I said suddenly, turning to Ranger Wilson, who walked beside me. "You have the one I gave you, right?" "That's proof." "We have it," he confirmed. "It's being analyzed, but preliminary examination suggests they're small animal bones, likely rodent or bird. Similar bags have been found on other islands in this region, usually placed by wildlife researchers tracking predator feeding habits." Of course, they had an explanation. They had an explanation for everything. The helicopter ride was mercifully loud, making conversation impossible. I stared out the window as we rose above the tree canopy, giving me my first complete view of the island. It looked so small from above, so ordinary. Just trees and rocks and the blue lake surrounding it all. As we banked to head toward the mainland, I caught sight of the northern section where the stone circle lay hidden beneath the trees. And there, just for a moment, I saw it. A small white figure standing in what had to be the center of the circle, looking up at the helicopter. Even from this height, I could tell it was her. She raised one pale arm as if in greeting or warning. I pressed my face against the glass, but a bank of clouds moved between us and the island, obscuring my view. When the clouds cleared seconds later, there was nothing to see but trees. I sank back in my seat, suddenly exhausted beyond words. No one would believe me. Maybe I didn't even believe myself anymore. But I knew what I'd seen, both in the circle and just now from the air. She was real, and my father was gone. As the island receded behind us, becoming just a dark speck on the lake's surface, I closed my eyes. The image of those scattered bones remained burned into my memory, along with the certainty that whatever happened on that island wasn't over. Not for me. The hospital discharged us after 2 days of observation. 48 hours of fluorescent lights, blood tests, psychological evaluations, and endless questions. The doctors found nothing physically wrong with me beyond mild dehydration and exhaustion. The official diagnosis was acute stress reaction with possible hallucinatory episodes. They prescribed rest, hydration, and follow-up appointments with a therapist. Mom picked us up from the hospital, her face a mask of grief and confusion. She'd flown in from her conference in Tokyo the moment she got the news about Dad. The drive home passed in near silence, Hannah staring out the window, Mom's knuckles white on the steering wheel. I watched the suburban landscape slide past, wondering how the world could look so normal when everything had changed. "They'll find him," Mom said as we pulled into our driveway. None of us believed it. Our house felt wrong without Dad. His coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter where he'd left it before our trip. His jacket hung by the door. His laptop sat closed on his desk in the study. The search teams were still combing the island, but after a week with no trace of him beyond our testimonies, even the most optimistic rangers admitted the chances of finding him alive were slim. I couldn't sleep that first night home. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pale girl reaching for me, felt her cold fingers on my cheek, smelled that awful rotting scent. I kept the lights on until dawn. The next morning, I found Hannah in the kitchen, making toast and acting like nothing had happened. "How can you just go on like normal?" I asked her. She shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "What else am I supposed to do? Talk about it? Admit what happened out there?" "What happened is Dad got lost or hurt somehow," she said flatly. "The rest was just your imagination going crazy from stress." "You saw the bone bag too," I reminded her. "Probably from some wildlife study, just like the ranger said." She grabbed her plate and pushed past me. "I'm not doing this, Paul." That conversation set the pattern for the weeks that followed. Hannah retreated into denial. Mom threw herself into working with the search authorities, and I became obsessed with finding answers. I started researching the island's history, spending hours at the public library and online. Most of what I found was mundane: geological surveys, bird migration patterns, conservation efforts. But buried in old newspaper archives and obscure historical journals, I discovered fragments that made my skin crawl. An 1887 newspaper article described 3 loggers who disappeared from a northern island in the same lake system where we'd camped. Their equipment was found undisturbed at their camp. A 1932 report mentioned a family of 4 who vanished during a camping trip, with only the youngest child found wandering the mainland shore 3 days later, unable or unwilling to speak about what happened. The oldest account came from a translation of indigenous oral histories recorded by a missionary in the 1830s. It referred to an island of the hungry spirit, where people who stayed too long were taken beyond the stones. The missionary had dismissed these as pagan superstitions, but included them in his ethnographic notes. None of these accounts specifically named our island, but the geographical descriptions matched. I printed everything I found and created a timeline on my bedroom wall, connecting the disappearances with red string like some conspiracy theorist. Mom saw it once and left the room without comment. Hannah refused to even look. 30 days after Dad disappeared, the search was officially scaled back. The ranger in charge, a different one from Wilson who'd found me, called to explain that they'd exhausted all reasonable search options. They'd used drones, cadaver dogs, thermal imaging, nothing. Dad was now classified as a missing person, presumed dead by misadventure. "We believe he may have fallen into the lake at night," the ranger said. "If that's the case, the body might never surface due to the lake's unusual depth and cold temperature." I wanted to scream that they were wrong, that I knew what happened, but what could I say? That an eyeless ghost girl took him, that I'd seen his bones scattered in a stone circle that was empty when the rangers arrived, that I'd experienced visions of the island's dark history through her touch. The nightmares started about a month after we returned home. Always the same. I'd find myself back in the stone circle at night. The pale girl would approach, reaching for me with those cold, dirty fingers. Sometimes Dad would be there too, but only as a pile of bones that would reassemble themselves into a skeleton that pointed accusingly at me. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, but the truly terrifying part came after I woke. 3 times now I'd turned on my bedside lamp to find small animal bones arranged in patterns on my nightstand or floor, tiny femurs and ribs forming spiral shapes. The first time I screamed and Mom came running, but by the time she reached my room, the bones had vanished. She thought I was still half asleep, confusing my nightmare with reality. The second time, I took photos with my phone before the bones disappeared. But when I looked at the photos the next morning, they showed only my empty nightstand. The third time, I didn't bother calling for help or taking pictures. I just stared at the bone spiral until it faded away like smoke. 2 months after the island, Mom suggested therapy again. I agreed, not because I thought it would help, but because I needed someone to talk to who wouldn't immediately shut me down. The therapist, Dr. Levine, listened without judgment as I told her everything. The pale girl, the visions, the bones that appeared and disappeared. "I don't think you're crazy, Paul," she said after I finished. "You experienced something traumatic, and your mind is processing it in complex ways. So you think I imagined it all? I think you experienced something real, the loss of your father under mysterious circumstances. How your mind interprets and processes that experience is unique to you. It wasn't the validation I wanted, but it wasn't outright dismissal either. I kept going to our weekly sessions, though I stopped mentioning the disappearing bones after the 3rd time. Hannah and I barely spoke anymore. She'd thrown herself into school activities, spending as little time at home as possible. When we did cross paths, the silence between us felt like a physical barrier. I missed my sister almost as much as I missed Dad. One night, I overheard her talking to Mom in the kitchen. "I'm worried about him," Hannah said. "He's not getting better, he's getting worse." "The doctor says it takes time," Mom replied. "Grief affects everyone differently." "It's not grief," Hannah said. "It's like he wants to believe something took Dad. Like he can't accept that Dad just made a mistake or had an accident." "And you?" Mom asked. "How are you processing it?" A long pause. "I just want to move on," Hannah finally said, her voice breaking. "I can't keep thinking about it. I can't." I slipped back to my room without letting them know I'd heard. Maybe Hannah was right. Maybe I was clinging to a supernatural explanation because the alternative, that Dad simply got lost or fell, or made some ordinary mistake that cost him his life, was too mundane, too random, too meaningless. But then why the bones by my bed? Why the nightmares that felt more like visitations? Why could I still feel the cold touch of the pale girl's fingers months later? The 6-month anniversary of Dad's disappearance fell on a Saturday. Mom was out of town at a conference. She'd started traveling for work again, though I knew she felt guilty about it. Hannah had gone to a friend's house for the weekend. I decided to visit Dad's empty grave alone. The cemetery was quiet that morning. Dad's headstone read Aaron Harvey, beloved husband and father, with his birth date and then a dash. No death date, since no body had ever been found. Just an empty casket buried 2 months after he vanished, when Mom decided we needed closure. I stood there for a long time, hands in my pockets against the autumn chill. The trees around the cemetery had started to turn, their leaves gold and red against the gray sky. Dad would have pointed out the species, explained the chemical process behind the color changes. He loved teaching us things like that, even when we pretended not to care. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," I said aloud. "I'm sorry I didn't understand what was happening until it was too late." A cool breeze rustled the leaves, and for a moment I thought I heard a whisper on the wind. I turned, scanning the empty cemetery, but saw no one. Then I heard it again, clearer this time, right beside my ear. "My child." The voice wasn't the pale girl's gravelly whisper. It was Dad's voice, warm, familiar, but somehow distant, like a call from very far away. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just fallen leaves swirling in the breeze. I waited, barely breathing, for the voice to come again, but the cemetery remained silent except for the rustling trees. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting. Eventually, I placed the small bunch of wildflowers I'd brought against the headstone and turned to leave. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not with malice, but with longing. Had the entity from the island somehow followed me home? Was that why I found bones by my bed? Why I still had nightmares? Or was it something else entirely? Some part of Dad caught between worlds, reaching out across whatever boundary separated us. I had no answers, only questions that I suspected would haunt me for the rest of my life. All I knew for certain was that something had happened on that island, something beyond rational explanation. And whether anyone else believed me or not, I would never forget the pale girl with the empty eyes, the cold touch that showed me visions, or the whisper of my father's voice calling me my child from somewhere I couldn't reach.